Now, there are two extra features of Galatians which bring the situation into sharp focus. First, the newest kid on the block, the fastest growing religion of the time, was the cult of Caesar and Rome. Pisidian Antioch, right there in the heart of it all, had been redesigned as a Roman colony. The architects made it as much like Rome as they could. Indeed, it was known as New Rome. It was a striking embodiment of the Roman agenda to bring their civilization and justice, justitia and dikaiosyne, to every corner of the world. After all, Caesar was obviously the most powerful god there was, having brought peace and freedom and prosperity to the world. All empires claim that sort of thing. In an age where our distinction between politics and religion didn't exist, your allegiance to Caesar meant both worship and paying tax. And the Greek word for allegiance was pistis, faith or faithfulness. And failing to offer that allegiance meant trouble at every level. A brick through the window is a brick through the window, whether the reason is religious or political. And it wouldn't just be bricks. You might well lose your job. A wife who converted and refused to join her husband in the normal civic religion might risk divorce. A converted slave might face harsh penalties, and so on. So Caesar, the Kyrios Kosmou, the Lord of the world, took his prominent place. By the middle of the 2nd century, a pinch of incense to Caesar's statue was a test case. Polycarp, 100 years after Paul, the Bishop of Smyrna, was burnt at the stake for refusing that pinch of incense. He wasn't the only one. Now, that's the first extra feature, but the second is the real crunch. The Jews were exempt from all this. The Romans had long realized that you just couldn't force Jews to worship idols. They would rather die. The Romans were pragmatic. Julius Caesar had recognized that this particular people thought that for some reason their God was the only God, so they wouldn't worship any others. But in other respects, the Jews were good citizens. They had high moral standards. They paid their taxes. So a deal was struck. The Jews would pray to their God for Rome or Caesar or for their local city and its officials, but they wouldn't pray to Caesar, and certainly not to Artemis or Aphrodite or Zeus or whoever. So the Jews had a free pass from normal pagan worship, and everybody knew it. So here's the three-dimensional, real-life, real-time issue, radically different, both from the old idea about people called Judaizers telling converts to do moral good works, and also from the rather decontextualized new perspective, where the question is simply, does a Gentile have to become a Jew to become a Christian? Imagine yourself a citizen of Lystra or Iconium. You live in a world where everybody worships the gods, because everybody does, and otherwise bad things will happen. But everybody knows that the Jews don't. It's grudgingly accepted that they do their own thing. But then quite suddenly, here is this new group based not on ethnicity, nor on social class, nor, shockingly, on gender. A ramshackle bits and pieces group, men and women, slaves and free, and even Jews and Gentiles together, and they have given up worshipping the gods. And they're meeting together in secret, something the Roman world was always very suspicious of. And they're talking about offering worship to a different Kyrios, or a different Basileus, another king. Indeed, that's about all these people have in common, allegiance to this Jesus, this Christos, this Kyrios. And when they're asked why they're not worshipping the gods, and particularly Lord Caesar, the answer is, you know the rules. We belong to Israel's Messiah. We are therefore children of Abraham, and we are therefore claiming the Jewish exemption. And with that, the fat is in the fire. For a start, it makes no sense to puzzled outsiders. In what way are these people Jews? By what right are they Abraham's offspring, whoever this Abraham was? They're ordinary people just like us, citizens of Antioch or Lystra or wherever. Anyway, they obviously aren't Jews. They don't live in that part of town. Their males aren't circumcised. They're not keeping the Jewish customs. And what is this talk about an anointed one, a Mashiach, a Christos? And did we hear that right, that this anointed one is actually the Lord of the world? Even the most generous-hearted citizens of Caesar's broad domains might shake their heads in puzzlement and anger. And word would get round. Small, tight-knit communities, everybody knows everybody else's business. Before too long, someone in authority is knocking on the door to find out what it's all about. And the more these strange, deluded people talk about Abraham and Israel and an anointed one, the sooner somebody will knock on the door of the synagogue leaders. Look, they'll say, you've lived among us peaceably. You do business with us. We don't understand you. We don't know why you don't join in our normal life, but we sort of respect you. You keep yourselves to yourselves. We've learned to live with that. But who then are these people who claim to be Abraham's children and so to be exempt from ordinary civic life and worship? The synagogue leaders will have known what was going on. Paul, after all, began his preaching in the synagogue in each place. He got an enthusiastic hearing, often from the Gentile God-fearers, the hangers-on around the edge. But the message about a crucified Messiah was too scandalous, too blasphemous for most Jews. So the synagogue leadership, faced with these questions, would try to disown this strange hybrid new grouping, not least those Jews who, despite the scandal, had been convinced that Jesus really was Israel's Messiah and had joined in with the new movement. But the leaders would do their best to discredit Paul, to portray him as a crazy maverick with a weird idea. I don't think the civic officials would be that impressed. They might suggest darkly that the synagogue leaders had better sort it all out. Otherwise, their own privileged exemption might be called into question. After all, if anyone and everyone could just stand up and announce, oh, by the way, I'm a Jew, what was to stop the system descending into chaos? Good fences make good neighbors. Clear ethnic boundaries mean we all know where we are. Paul's crazy multi-ethnic church was indeed a novelty, a new creation, and a very disturbing one. So the synagogue leaders will be thinking, we need to get those strange Gentile Jesus followers into line with synagogue discipline, at least outwardly, so we'll be able to get the pagan officials off our backs. So the synagogue leaders would put pressure on Jewish Jesus followers to persuade their strange new Gentile friends to adopt just enough Jewish custom to look good, to make a good showing in the flesh before anyone who might be interested. The men would have to get circumcised. And the Jewish community could thereby demonstrate to anyone who was interested that this new group, though unexpected, was, so to speak, kosher. That's what the agitators, the troublers, as Paul calls them, will have been saying. Now, that solution might have looked attractive from one point of view, but it generated real anger. The social and civic pressure could easily turn violent, as social pressures can still do even in our enlightened times. The instructions in Galatians 5 and 6 are not generalized ethics. They focus quite sharply on factional and social squabbling and quarreling and even violence, and people trying to play one-up games against each other. Paul speaks about biting and devouring each other. But notice what sense this all makes of his charge in chapter 6, that those who want you to be circumcised are not in fact interested in proper law-keeping, either for themselves or for you. They just want to make a good showing in the flesh in order to avoid persecution. It all fits.